My name is Rosemary Baird Andreae, and I'm going to talk about the central London Georgian townhouse of Mrs. Montagu, the Queen of the Bluestockings. I started working on Mrs. Montagu for a book called Mistress of the House, Great Ladies and Grand Houses, in which I was trying to find the best of Hardwicks of the long 18th century. And of the 10 women that I wrote about, Mrs. Montagu proved the most fascinating. Here she is, painted in 1762 by Alan Ramsay. The term bluestocking was in fact coined by Mrs. Montagu herself. She famously used to have small assemblies like the salons in Paris, presided over by hostesses. And at these meetings, friends would discuss literature, poetry, theology, philosophy, whatever they wanted to talk about. And at one such meeting in 1756, a gentleman attended by the name of Benjamin Stillingfleet. He was wearing blue worsted stockings, and these were not really correct for such a social gathering in a smart house. He should have been wearing white silk stockings. And so afterwards, Mrs. Montagu, rather charmingly, and I'm sure in a very friendly way, just referred to him as the blue stocking. Well, the term, of course, was coined for her many groups of friends who used to share ideas. Initially, as I say, many of these were men. Eventually, the group became more and more feminine. But among the men who would therefore visit the house I'm going to talk about were Sir Joshua Reynolds, Dr. Johnson, Lord Lyttelton, the Earl of Bath, David and Eva Garrick, and then, of course, the women as well. Elizabeth Carter, her great friend, the classicist, was often there, Hester Caponi, and later, because they were younger, Fanny Burney and Hannah More. So this house was the scene of very many interesting gatherings. How did Elizabeth become such an intellectual? She came from a family on the edges of the aristocracy. Her cousin was Sir Thomas Robinson of Rokeby. She grew up in Kent. What really changed her life was when her grandmother married a Cambridge Don, Dr. Conyers Middleton, and she used to go to stay with them. Dr. Middleton was the university librarian, and he used to take her with him out to Wimpole Hall, the home of the bibliophile Earl of Oxford. And there, Elizabeth was befriended by Lady Margaret Cavendish Harley, Lord Oxford's daughter, when Margaret was 17 and Elizabeth was barely 12. But Margaret found this girl so longing to find out everything about the world, so the two talked about books, about nature. They had a lot of fun together, and this friendship was to last for the whole of their lives. Lady Margaret married the Duke of Portland, and Elizabeth would go to stay with them in London for the season, and also at Bulstrode, their country home. So Elizabeth then, how did she come to have this house in Hill Street? She married in 1742 Edward Montagu, a grandson of the Earl of Sandwich. He was nearly 30 years older than her. And Edward was in fact very reclusive. He loved science, he loved astronomy, and he wanted nothing more than for him to be able to stay at home while his wife rushed around managing his estates, some of which were in the north of England, and sorting out his houses. First of all, he took her to live in the country. And this shows them at their home at Sandalford Priory, just south of Newbury, the view out over the water to the country beyond. Here are Mr. and Mrs. Montagu on the right, and with her sister, Sarah Sands, in blue, a chair being brought up for her. And beyond, you see the haymakers. Mrs. Montagu famously celebrated the people who worked so hard for her, and she used to give them wonderful harvest suppers. Indeed, later, she would give great lunches on the 1st of May for chimney sweeps in London. So their first house was Sandalford Priory, an old abbey, and out of respect for her husband, Elizabeth didn't do too much to it at the start, though later she would indeed change it quite a lot. it was natural that they would have a London home. And initially they lived in Dover Street, where he already had a house. They called it Dovershire because so many of their country friends lived there. But in 1744, this street started to be developed just off Berkeley Square, Hill Street. Now, when I started the work, it wasn't thought that this house existed anymore. And indeed, the sources on Mrs. Montagu were really very sparse. There was a book about the Bluestockings by an American scholar, and otherwise just her letters published by her descendants were in existence in books. In fact, there are a huge number of letters by her. Nearly 8,000 are extant, of which nearly 7,000 are in the Huntington Library in California. So I was picking out bits from different letters about her homes. Anyway, I thought I'd walk along Hill Street. I knew she lived at number 23, and have a look just in case there was something there. And to my great joy, I found this wonderful group of houses. So I rang up Westminster Council and I said, has Hill Street ever been renumbered? They said, oh yes, what number do you want to know about? And I said, oh, 23. And they said, oh yes, 23 is now number 31. So there we were, this wonderful 5-story house with its largest rooms, of course, on the piano nobile, over a rusticated basement, and with obelisks at the gate. So then I had to try to get in. I wrote to the occupants, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and they weren't dead keen, but they grudgingly allowed me to come for a visit. Now, what was I looking for at this first visit? I knew that Mrs. Montagu had a Chinese dressing room. She'd written to her sister, my house looks like an Indian warehouse. This is because she had so many, in fact, Chinese, they often called it Indian, Chinese items, vases and figures in the house. And then 1750, my dressing room in London is like the temple of some Indian god. That was when it was first finished. And Madame du Bocage went to an assembly in 1750. She said it was in a closet lined with painted paper of Pekin and furnished with the choicest movables of China. And 2 years later, Mrs. Montagu to Francis Boscawen, the Chinese room was filled by a succession of people from 11 in the morning till 11 at night. Well, one could roughly work out that the Chinese room was off a larger room. That's how she managed to have so many people. At one stage, she described having 100 in the apartment. So I was looking for a Chinese room, and I also knew from a brief mention that there had been a bedroom apparently painted with zephyrs. So what did I find? Well, going up the stairs, the main room on the first floor, this wonderful Rococo ceiling. I was very thrilled by this because although there are many Rococo ceilings and indeed Boiseries in Paris, in London, there aren't as many as one might like to think. And I thought this one was particularly good, but I was very puzzled by these roundels in the corners. However, it was wonderful to be in there, and I couldn't actually photograph it any more than this because this was a bank, and below this height, it was all filing cabinets and people working, and they really didn't want me in there at all. So I didn't have very long, and then I went into the adjacent room. I can only describe this as the shock because we had no idea that anything of her painted dressing room might be so completely extant. The figure in the middle was confusing. Possibly it could have been Zephyr, the west wind. But what was intriguing was the 8 roundels. It didn't take long to work out. They had 12 figures, so they're the figures of the zodiac. And indeed, often 2 figures have been put together. The painting in between, all very beautifully done. And then looking around the room, what else were we looking for? Well, we knew she'd had this very Chinese dressing room. We weren't entirely sure of Robert Adams' relationship to it, but we know that she had it toned down. She wrote in 1765, "I rejoice that we may so soon meet in the Chinese room, where the elements are much mitigated, as befits the winter season." And then she commented how well mitigated they were. "My dressing room is really wonderfully pretty. Mr. Adam has done his best. He has exerted much genius in the doors in emulation of his rival Stuart." And that's just over a year from the previous reference. So he'd done very well. Now, in fact, this is not a doorcase by Adam. What Adam created were wonderful painted doors. Cipriani actually painted the panels, and we don't know what his doorcase was like, but this is probably too busy a scheme to be by Adam, and is thought to be by James Athenian Stuart, who we know was working for Mrs. Montagu at about this time. But he was variously said to be working in her dressing room and also in another room. However, what really gave a good clue was his chimney piece. I went back quite soon afterwards with two architectural historians who confirmed that these tipped urns were absolutely typical of James Athenian Stuart. And what was in fact a bit confusing was in the letters, we found that Adam had persuaded Mrs. Montagu to have a marble chimney piece for the room. She begrudged the expense. And this didn't look to be at all like Adam. But what I think in fact happened is that she had the Adam chimney piece put in, and that it was probably then moved to the front room, the saloon. And of course, I was not able to photograph that area at the time, below the top level. So James Athenian Stuart, and more obvious that it is his work. Here, one of 4 paintings in the corners. Now, I was working at pace to get my book out in 2003, and I also wanted to publish the room just to get it out there to see what other people thought. So I published it in Apollo. But it was really in 2008 when David Pullins, who was at the Courtauld for the time, is now working in the Met. He's an American scholar. And he showed that in fact this cornice was from Adam's design, and indeed that Stuart had put his paintings into a wider scheme that was originally Adam's own scheme. So this drawing, which I had published from Sir John Soane's museum, shows the 8 roundels, but you will see the little people in there are all Chinese. And indeed, it has these long borders with corners with square decoration in the corner. He calls it a ceiling of a room at Mrs. Montagu's house, very much suggesting that it had actually been completed. Adam also designed a carpet for the room, the drawing for which is also in the Sir John Soane Museum. So here again is the ceiling, now professionally photographed when I went on the second visit. And you can see James Athenian Stuart's roundels and his painting in between and the borders. And some details. This is Aquarius, the water bearer. I think the colours are lovely, and also look at these little flower arrangements. And this is one where he combines 2 of the characters. So here you have Cancer the crab, who is being rather horribly got at by Scorpio with his scorpion, about to be stung, I fear. And this explains a lot why back in the first room, we have these strange roundels, also by James Athenian Stuart. In fact, the chimney piece, which was here, which I didn't photograph, very sadly was stolen about 5 years, I think nothing to do with my article, about 5 years after my article, between the lease of the bank and a law firm. Cowboy builders went in and they took chimney piece here, also, I'm afraid, the James Athenian Stuart one in the room beyond. Apparently this quite often happens in central London between leases. And so a detail of that roundel, which is of the elements, and this is birds and music as symbols of air. James Athenian Stewart was quite a difficult person to have as an employee. He, in fact, had started really as a painter and wasn't really properly trained as an architect. And he often didn't finish things. There's a letter in which Sarah says to her sister Elizabeth, "I'm so sorry that Mr. Stewart has had no pity on your third room." He often didn't get on with things. But we know that he did paint for her also a bedroom with many zephyrets. And it's from David Pullen's 2008 article that we can see exactly where he worked. This is the dressing room, originally a whole very Chinese scheme. Then Robert Adam, for a short time, had his Chinese version, and then the neoclassical version by James Athenian Stewart. But Stewart had also painted the bedchamber with zephyrs and zephyrets. Mrs. Delaney, also a close friend of the Duchess of Portland, visited the house for the opening of the new dressing room in 1773. And she was rather horrified. She said, "Mrs. Montagu has a room of Cupidons." So there were obviously more of these putty, not just on the ceiling, but on the walls as well. Absolutely nothing survives of the bedchamber, which is very sad. But it seems that, in fact, Stewart did the bedchamber first, perhaps completed in about 1767, and that he did the dressing room from about 1768 to 72. And this Rococo ceiling here, of course, at the front. Well, Mrs. Montagu apparently didn't want to go on with the Chinese room. Perhaps she thought all the Chinese things were just too feminine. And in fact, in 2010, Stacey Sloboda, who is an American scholar as well, a professor, she wrote a very good article about the first dressing room, drawn entirely from documentation, and also with photographs of a couple of pieces of Linnell furniture, which had been in the dressing room. And in 2014, she brought out a book about chinoiserie. And so she's a very good scholar of English 18th century subjects. Mrs. Montagu went on for a little bit with James Athenian Stewart. She asked him to design her a house in Portman Square. This is from 1775, when the square was first being developed. She took a lease. And in fact, her husband Edward sadly died that year. It had been a very happy marriage. I think they'd both played their part in it very beautifully, and they were happy together. This, of course, meant she was even more wealthy. She'd always been economical, but she enjoyed spending on houses. But it liberated her to create something much bigger and grander. And I think it was also part of her sort of intellectual development. She'd written a lot, dialogues of the dead. She'd written a lot about Shakespeare. She was very interested in literature. Perhaps she wanted to be taken more seriously. Even at the time, her salons were becoming more feminine, but she wanted to put the Chinese part behind her and be more in the neoclassical style. So this is what this big house is for. It's across the top northwest corner of the square, at an angle adjacent to Hume House. And sadly, it was bombed in the Blitz. And although there are photographs of it as it was before it was bombed, the house was then pulled down. I was glad to work out, I think for the first time, that her feather room, for which I'd also been looking, she'd had tapestries made of feathers. They were made, in fact, at Sandalford because the feathers kept floating away, and that was easier in the country. But this was her feather room here. And indeed, she was extremely excited when, in 1791, Queen Charlotte brought all her 6 daughters to visit her house in Portman Square, in particular, the feather room. James Athenian Stewart was becoming increasingly hopeless. He was often drunk, he was lazy, the workmen didn't turn up. And so she asked a designer called Joseph Bonamy to do her design for her great room. In fact, this was exhibited as early as 1782 at the Royal Academy, though the great room wasn't complete till nearly 10 years later. But you see how very much more serious she's become. She was very interested in the efforts to discover more about Grecian architecture. And I think it's intriguing that she would go this far. I mean, Adam, of course, such an expert in everything Roman, from Pompeii and Herculaneum. I say serious, but in fact, Mrs. Montague's entertainments at Portman Square were the most glittering, and even Horace Walpole approved of what she had done. Meanwhile, she was a wonderful family person, a proto-grandmother to her great nieces and nephews, the 10 children of her nephew, Matthew Robinson, who was her heir and came to live at Sandalford. However, for my money, this house at Hill Street tells us much more about Mrs. Montagu. Her friends, I think, tended to be more intellectual than necessarily grand. She simply enjoyed the company of people whom she found extremely interesting, and she liked to guide their discussions onto different topics and to develop the conversation. So they would come in the first door, up the stairs, and into her Rococo saloon through these 3 bays, and they'd walk to the back to her exotic dressing room in whichever format it was. And then, as part of the formal enfilade, they would go beyond to the left and see her formal Zephyr bedchamber behind the staircase and a little servery here. And indeed, I'm sure she would have had a private bedchamber as well on the floor above. The Zephyr, I think, a red herring perhaps, that painting, later painting done in the centre of Stuart's painted ceiling. I have to emphasise this house is absolutely not open to the public. More is coming out all the time about Mrs. Montagu. Elizabeth Eager, who is literary historian, is writing her biography, and the Elizabeth Montagu Letters Network is an initiative which is being worked on in partnership with the Huntington Library in California. And this is for all her letters to be published, rather than the smaller selections published by her descendants. Indeed, I've had a little mission in trying to bring together the literary historians with we art and architectural historians, because I feel they often move into material history, which I think is really the social history of objects. And perhaps it might be fun if they joined up more with us who are so interested in the history as well of furniture and silver, and with scholars who are doing really specialist academic work on these objects. And indeed, to this end, it's been my great pleasure to take some of the Bluestocking philosophers of the 21st century, these lovely ladies, to both Hill Street and to Sandalford Priory. So I hope you found that an interesting interlude. It's just a story of a lady and her London townhouse.